Soulful possession. A father's desperate pact. On a fateful night in a small Vietnamese village, two grave robbers set out to steal the heart of a recently deceased maiden, Lisa, buried in the village cemetery. Under the cover of a full moon, they sneak past lurking shadows and a horse-drawn carriage, hiding amidst the rocky outcrops. Their goal to exhume Lisa's body and retrieve her heart for a mystical ritual known as the soul-guiding concoction. After grueling hours of digging and evading potential threats, they finally unearth the coffin. The stench of decay permeates the air as they open the lid to reveal Lisa's body. With trembling hands, the lead grave robber slices through the flesh, extracting the heart, still inexplicably fresh and crimson. They quickly flee the cemetery, leaving behind a desecrated grave. Meanwhile, in the village, a rich but childless man named Mr. Bolton seeks a way to continue his bloodline. Desperate, he resorts to an ancient dark ritual requiring the heart of a young maiden. Bolton commissions the robbers to obtain Lisa's heart, hoping to make a gruesome soup that could cure his son Liam of an ominous illness. However, the ritual opens the door to something far more sinister. Disturbing occurrences plague Bolton's household as an eerie presence looms around his son. In the days following the ritual, Liam becomes possessed by Lisa's tormented spirit. He exhibits strange behavior, including applying makeup and staring eerily into a mirror. His eyes turn pitch black, reflecting a haunted soul within. Bolton is tormented by ghostly visions and inexplicable sensations. The tale culminates in a night of terror where Bolton, plagued by his actions, succumbs to a dreadful fate. His chest bursts open, revealing a pulsating, unnatural growth. The next morning, his wife finds him dead, twisted in agony, with a claw-like mark over his heart, signaling the culmination of the vengeful spirit's wrath. The dark ritual, intended to save a life, instead brings about death and eternal horror. Part 1. The Grave Robber's Mission. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cemetery. It was a night thick with mist, the air damp and cold, wrapping the village graveyard in a shroud of darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted a sound that cut through the silence like a warning. But Gregory and Oliver had no time for fear. They were men with a mission. A mission as gruesome as it was lucrative. Underneath their heavy cloaks, the two men moved swiftly along the narrow path to the graveyard, their boots crunching on the gravel. The flicker of their lanterns barely cut through the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead. They had been hired for a grim task, one that required both skill and a heart as cold as the soil they were about to dig up. Their client, Mr. Bolton, had paid them handsomely, with a promise of more if they succeeded in their dreadful deed to steal the heart of a newly buried maiden named Lisa. Lisa's family had laid her to rest only 3 nights ago. To everyone else in the village, her death was a tragedy, a young life snatched away too soon. But to Gregory and Oliver, it was an opportunity. Mr. Bolton, a man of wealth and sinister secrets, needed Lisa's heart for an ancient ritual to save his sickly son. They didn't ask questions in their line of work. Curiosity could get you killed. All they knew was that Mr. Bolton demanded a purer, untouched heart, and Lisa, the village's cherished maiden, fit that description perfectly. "This way," Gregory whispered, his voice barely a breath in the stillness. He clutched a map of the cemetery in his gloved hand, following the winding path through rows of tombstones. Oliver nodded, the grim look on his face highlighted by the dim lantern light. They pushed forward, the weight of their tools in the sacks they carried adding to the gravity of their mission. As they approached the center of the cemetery, the air grew colder, the fog thicker, as if the spirits of the dead were closing in around them. It was then that they spotted it, Lisa's grave. A modest stone marked her resting place, a recent wreath of wilting flowers still draped over it. Gregory shivered, whether from the chill or the unnerving aura of the place, he couldn't tell. He glanced at Oliver, who was already pulling out the shovels. "Let's make this quick," Oliver muttered, his eyes darting nervously around them. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig sent his heart racing, the fear of being caught weighing heavily on his mind. But there was something else, something darker lurking in the shadows, an unseen presence that made his skin crawl. They dug feverishly, each thrust of the shovel a reminder of the heinous act they were committing. The earth gave way slowly, resisting their intrusion, as if trying to protect the secret it harbored. Gregory's muscles strained with every heave of dirt, sweat mixing with the cold mist on his brow. As they got deeper, the sound of their breathing grew labored, their faces grim with concentration. Minutes felt like hours, the silence only broken by the occasional distant cry of a night creature. Finally, with a dull thud, their shovels hit something solid. They exchanged a glance, a mix of dread and determination in their eyes. Gregory crouched down and brushed away the remaining soil with his hands, revealing the wooden lid of Lisa's coffin. The wood was still fresh, the nails glistening in the lantern light. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. "Open it," Oliver urged, his voice shaky. Gregory hesitated for a second, his stomach churning. He had done this before, many times, but tonight felt different. There was an unnatural tension in the air, a feeling that they were trespassing on something sacred. Yet the lure of payment and the fear of their client's wrath pushed him on. He wedged the crowbar into the coffin lid and pried it open with a creak that echoed in the night. A foul, putrid odor wafted out, causing both men to gag and turn away momentarily. As the lid came off, the lantern's light fell upon Lisa's body. Her once beautiful face was now pale, sunken, the lips drawn back to reveal clenched teeth. A faint trace of moonlight seeped through the trees, illuminating her in a ghastly, almost ethereal glow. "There she is," Gregory muttered, trying to ignore the bile rising in his throat. "Get the heart." Oliver reached into his sack and pulled out a small, sharp knife. His hands trembled as he leaned forward, his breath shallow and rapid. He placed the blade against her chest, his eyes locked onto the spot where her heart lay still and cold. With a swift motion, he cut through the fabric of her burial dress, exposing her chest. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his hand shook violently as he made the incision. For a moment, he thought he heard a faint sigh escape Lisa's lips, as though she were resisting even in death. His mind reeled, screaming at him to stop, to run, but he forced himself to continue. Blood, dark and sluggish, oozed from the cut, staining the burial gown. Then something strange happened. As his hands delved into her chest, they felt warmth. Oliver froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Gregory," whispered, his voice quivering. "It's warm." Gregory glanced over, his face twisting in confusion and fear. "Impossible," he muttered, but curiosity got the better of him. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. The sight made his blood run cold. Lisa's heart was indeed warm. Worse yet, it throbbed faintly, as if trying to beat. "This isn't right," Oliver stammered, his breath quickening. "We should leave it." "No," Gregory hissed back, panic and greed mingling in his voice. "We've come too far." "Do it now." With a grimace, Oliver clenched his teeth and forced himself to act. His fingers closed around the heart, wrenching it free with a sickening squelch. A sudden gush of warm blood coated his hands, steaming in the cold night air. It felt alive, pulsating even as he held it, a grisly mockery of life. The two men stumbled back, horror etched on their faces. Gregory snatched a cloth from his sack and wrapped the heart tightly, stuffing it into a small iron box they had brought along. His eyes darted around the graveyard, expecting shadows to move, to reach out and drag them into the earth. "Cover it up," he barked, his voice tight with fear. Oliver nodded numbly, shoveling the dirt back into the grave with frantic, jerky movements. Each handful felt like an accusation, a reminder of the desecration they had committed. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, watching, judging. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of dread. When the grave was finally filled, they hastily scattered the wilted flowers over the fresh soil, hoping to mask their crime. But it was futile. The earth itself seemed to groan in protest, the air growing colder, thicker, as if the graveyard had come alive to mourn the disturbance. "Let's go," Gregory rasped, grabbing Oliver by the arm. They turned and fled, not daring to look back, the iron box clutched tightly in Gregory's hand. The mist swallowed them up as they ran, the shadows closing in behind them, whispering curses on the wind. The cemetery fell silent once more, but the ground they had disturbed remained unsettled, a scar on the land that would fester and grow. As they stumbled through the village streets, their minds were plagued with an ominous sense of doom. They had what they came for, but at what cost? Lisa's heart beat faintly within the iron box, an unnatural rhythm that seemed to echo their own racing pulses. They exchanged a glance, their faces pale and haunted. This job had awakened something far darker than they had anticipated. Somewhere in the darkness, a low wail rose up, carried by the wind. It was the sound of sorrow, of anger, a lament for a soul disturbed. And deep in the grave they had left desecrated, a soft thump echoed a heartbeat that refused to die. Thus, The grave robbers completed their ghastly task, but as they fled into the shadows, one thing was clear: their actions had set a curse in motion, one that would follow them and Mr. Bolton, haunting their every step. The night was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Part 2. Desperate Measures. The air inside the Grand Bolton mansion was heavy, laden with an almost suffocating tension. It was a stark contrast to the wealth and opulence that surrounded Mr. Bolton and his wife, Margaret. Tonight their grand dining room, with its glittering chandeliers and antique furniture, felt more like a chamber of horror. Shadows danced along the richly adorned walls, cast by the flickering candles that filled the room with a dim, almost eerie light. Mr. Bolton sat at the edge of the long polished dining table, his eyes fixated on the small iron box placed before him. His hands, usually steady and commanding, now trembled slightly. He reached out with a shaky breath, fingers grazing the cold, unfeeling metal surface. It felt like a weight pressing down on his soul, an object not of salvation but of the grave itself. Inside that box lay the heart stolen from a young maiden, still warm when ripped from its resting place. The final, horrifying ingredient for the ritual that might save his son. Margaret stood a few feet away, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and revulsion. She had heard of her husband's plans, of the ritual that was to be their last, desperate attempt to save their dying son, Liam. But hearing about it was one thing, witnessing it, watching her husband take these horrific steps, was another entirely. She clasped her hands together, feeling her nails dig into the soft flesh of her palms, hoping the pain would somehow ground her in the moment. "You're really going through with this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire in the nearby hearth. This abomination. Mr. Bolton did not meet her eyes. His gaze remained fixed on the box, his expression a blend of grim determination and haunting dread. "Do you think I want this?" he snapped, though his voice was not angry, just desperate. "Do you think I relish the thought of desecrating the dead, of boiling a human heart in our own home?" Margaret shuddered. The words, raw and vicious, hung in the air like a death knell. No, she did not think he wanted this, but she knew that his love for Liam, their only child, was greater than any fear or horror that lay before them. Mr. Bolton was a man of means, a man who was used to controlling his destiny. But this was something far beyond wealth or power. This was dealing with forces that should have been left untouched. "Bring it to the kitchen," he ordered quietly, finally finding the strength to lift the box. His hands still trembled, the box feeling unnaturally heavy in his grip. With a motion that was almost reverent, he stood and began to walk toward the kitchen, Margaret trailing behind him, her face as pale as the moonlight that crept through the window panes. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and comfort, had been transformed into something out of a nightmare. The table was cleared, and in its center sat a large iron pot, blackened from years of use. The hearth blazed with an unnaturally bright fire, its heat filling the room, making the air thick and stifling. Beside the pot lay a bundle of herbs and a small vial of crimson liquid. The mystic's instructions had been clear. Each step of the ritual had to be followed precisely, with no room for error. Any deviation could spell disaster for not just Liam, but for them all. Margaret felt her stomach churn as Mr. Bolton placed the box on the table. He paused, his breathing heavy, before opening it with a click. The lid creaked, revealing the contents inside the heart, still wrapped in the cloth stained dark with dried blood. A faint, metallic scent wafted through the room, mixing with the smell of burning wood and herbs. Margaret turned away, clamping a hand over her mouth to suppress a gag. This was madness, utter madness. And yet she did not stop him, could not stop him. "It's for Liam," Mr. Bolton muttered to himself, a mantra to keep his courage from faltering. He reached into the box, his fingers curling around the heart. It felt unnaturally warm, pulsing slightly against his palm. A chill ran down his spine, and for a moment he thought he felt it throb, a faint, grotesque echo of life. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to stay focused. Margaret watched in horror as he lifted the heart and carried it to the pot. "Richard." "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Mr. Bolton replied, his voice cold and final. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, filled with the pain of a father standing on the precipice of the unthinkable. He couldn't bear to lose Liam. Not like this. Not after exhausting every doctor, every treatment, every possible cure known to the world. This was their last hope, twisted as it was. With a deep breath, he dropped the heart into the pot. It hit the bottom with a sickening plop, causing both him and Margaret to flinch. For a moment, nothing happened. The heart just lay there, motionless, in the dark water. Then it began to float, bobbing up and down, as if resisting its fate. Mr. Bolton grabbed the ladle and began stirring, his movements slow and deliberate. The sound of the ladle scraping against the iron filled the room, a haunting melody of despair. As he stirred, he added the herbs, their earthy scent momentarily masking the metallic tang of blood. Margaret turned away, unable to watch as her husband followed the ritual's instructions to the letter. Her eyes landed on the hearth's fire, blazing hotter and brighter than it had any right to be. It seemed alive, as if it were watching, waiting for what was to come. The liquid in the pot began to bubble, a low, ominous sound that resonated through the kitchen. Mr. Bolton's face was drenched in sweat, his eyes wild and feverish. "The vial," he muttered, reaching for the small container filled with crimson liquid. His hand shook as he removed the stopper, a drop of the liquid spilling onto the table, sizzling as it touched the wood. He poured the rest into the pot, the bubbling intensifying as the liquid hissed and frothed. The heart writhed within the soup, twisting and contracting in a macabre dance. Margaret clutched her chest, feeling a surge of terror that almost drove her to scream. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. "It's working," Mr. Bolton whispered, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "It has to work," but even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. The mystic's words echoed in his ears, a grim warning that had haunted him since the day he sought her out. "If the heart rejects the ritual, you will face consequences far worse than death." And looking at the heart now, writhing in the pot like a creature struggling for release. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going horribly wrong. Suddenly, the room grew colder. The fire in the heart dimmed, the shadows lengthening and creeping across the walls. Margaret gasped, backing away, her eyes darting around as an unnatural chill seeped into her bones. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing down on her lungs, making it hard to breathe. "Richard," she cried out, her voice trembling. "Stop this." Please, Mr. Bolton didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the pot, on the heart that seemed to fight against his every stir. He gritted his teeth, staring faster, harder, as if trying to force the ritual to succeed through sheer willpower. "No," he growled, his face contorted in desperation. "This will work. It must work." The pot's contents began to swirl violently, the liquid turning a deep, dark crimson. The heart bobbed to the surface, pulsating erratically, its rhythm chaotic and disjointed. A loud hiss filled the air, followed by a piercing wail that reverberated through the kitchen, making the very walls shudder. Margaret screamed, clutching her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Richard, stop!" She sobbed bad, falling to her knees. "For the love of God, stop!" But Mr. Bolton was beyond reason. He was lost in the ritual, in his frantic need to save Liam at any cost. "Liam," he cried, his voice cracking with anguish. "This is for you?" The heart gave one final, violent throb, before bursting open with a wet, splattering sound. Dark blood sprayed across the kitchen, splashing onto Mr. Bolton's face, his clothes, the walls. The pot rattled, nearly toppling over as the soup inside churned violently, bubbling over and spilling onto the floor. The room filled with an overpowering stench of rot and decay, so foul that it made Margaret retch, doubling over in horror. The heart, now a torn and twisted mass of tissue, sank back into the pot. The bubbling ceased, leaving behind a stillness that was more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Mr. Bolton staggered back, his eyes wide, his face pale. His hand shook uncontrollably, dropping the ladle as he stumbled against the table, struggling to remain upright. "Richard," Margaret choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "What have you done?" He stared at the pot, his mind reeling. The ritual had failed. Part 3. The Heart Ritual. The first light of dawn crept into the Bolton mansion, casting eerie shadows across the wooden floors and fine drapery. In the kitchen, the remnants of last night's gruesome ritual still lingered. The stained iron pot lay cold and crusted on the table, the acrid scent of boiled blood and herbs hanging heavily in the air. Mr. Bolton sat at the kitchen table, his eyes bloodshot, staring blankly at the pot, replaying the horror of the previous night over and over in his mind. Could this truly work? Would the heart, the ritual, be enough to save his son? His hand, still trembling, reached for the bowl of thick, dark broth resting on the counter. The soup had congealed overnight, a gelatinous mass now shimmering with a nauseating crimson hue. It looked like death itself, trapped in a bowl. He forced himself to lift it, the weight of the moment crushing down on him as he turned toward the hallway that led to his son's room. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with sleepless terror. "Richard, you can't be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. She glanced at the bowl in his hands, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. This is madness. "We can't feed him that, we have no choice," Bolton replied, his voice hollow, drained of emotion. The ritual was performed. "This is our last hope," Margaret recoiled, her lips parting, as if to argue, but the sight of her husband's desperate, hollow eyes silenced her. She knew he was right. They had come too far, crossed too many lines to turn back now. All for Liam, their precious boy. The fear of losing him gnawed at her soul like a relentless beast. With a shaky breath, she stepped aside, allowing Mr. Bolton to pass. The walk to Liam's room felt like a march toward doom. Bolton's grip on the bowl tightened, knuckles turning white as he pushed open the door with his shoulder. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn to keep out the morning light. Liam lay on the bed, his small frame almost swallowed by the heavy blankets. His face was pallid, lips tinged with blue, eyes shut tight as he clung to the last shreds of life. Liam, Bolton called softly, his voice cracking with suppressed emotion. The boy didn't stir. Bolton swallowed the lump in his throat and moved closer, setting the bowl on the nightstand. Margaret stood at the doorway, clutching the frame, as if to anchor herself to reality, her eyes fixed on her son's frail figure. Bolton sat on the edge of the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gently lifted Liam's head, propping him up with a pillow. The boy's eyes fluttered open, revealing two glazed orbs that struggled to focus on his father's face. Bolton could feel his resolve faltering, the enormity of what he was about to do crashing down on him. But he had to be strong. For Liam. "Drink this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He scooped a spoonful of the dark, viscous liquid from the bowl, lifting it toward Liam's lips. The boy turned his head weakly, a reflexive grimace crossing his face at the smell. Bolton's heart clenched. Would his son reject it? Would the ritual fail even now? "Liam, you must," he insisted, forcing his tone to be firm, yet pleading. Margaret watched in horror, her hand flying to her mouth as she stifled a sob. She wanted to rush forward, to grab the bowl and hold it across the room, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place slowly. Liam's lips parted. Bolton seized the moment, slipping the spoon into his son's mouth. The boy grimaced, his throat convulsing as he swallowed. Bolton fed him another spoonful, then another, ignoring the cold sweat beading on his own brow. With each swallow, a mix of revulsion and hope twisted inside him, a tangled knot of emotions he couldn't unravel. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Bolton watched his son, searching for any sign, any reaction. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then it happened. Liam stirred. His eyes widened, the glaze clearing away to reveal a spark of awareness. He blinked, his chest rising with a deep, shuddering breath. Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, eyes filling with tears of disbelief. Slowly, painfully, Liam pushed himself up, his body trembling, as if fighting off an unseen force. A faint color crept back into his cheeks, the blue tinge fading from his lips. Liam Bolton breathed, his voice breaking. The boy looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time in weeks his eyes were bright, alive. "Dad," Liam croaked, his voice hoarse and weak, but unmistakably present. Margaret let out a strangled cry, rushing forward to embrace her son. Bolton felt a rush of warmth flood his chest, a wave of relief so overwhelming that it threatened to knock him over. He had done it. They had done it. Liam was coming back to them. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she hugged Liam, her body racked with silent sobs. "Oh, Liam, my sweet boy," she whispered, stroking his hair, kissing his forehead. Bolton sat back, his shoulders sagging, his head dropping into his hands as he let out a shaky, ragged breath. It had worked. The ritual, the soup, somehow it had worked. For a moment the room was filled with nothing but the sounds of quiet sobs and the rustling of blankets as Liam settled into his mother's arms. Hope, fragile and fleeting, blossomed in their hearts, chasing away the shadow of despair that had gripped them for so long. "We did it," Bolton whispered, lifting his head to look at Margaret. She nodded, unable to speak, her eyes never leaving Liam's face. The boy was still weak, still pale, but he was sitting up, breathing, alive. And that was more than they had dared to dream just a few hours ago. But as the morning light grew brighter, creeping further into the room, an uneasy feeling settled in the back of Bolton's mind. He pushed it aside, too consumed by the joy of seeing his son's eyes open once more. Margaret helped Liam lie back down, tucking the blankets around him. "Rest now, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're going to be all right," Liam nodded, his eyes fluttering shut as exhaustion overtook him. Margaret turned to Bolton, a question lingering in her gaze, but he shook his head. Not now, not when they had just witnessed this miracle. They needed to hold on to this moment to believe, if only for a little while, that everything would be fine. Hours passed, and the household began to stir back to life. Servants whispered in the hallways, their eyes wide as they caught glimpses of Liam sitting up in his bed. The miracle spread through the mansion like wildfire, a beacon of hope in what had been a dark and grim reality. Bolton and Margaret kept watch over their son, their spirits lifting with each passing hour that he remained stable. But as the day wore on, a cold, nagging sense of dread began to creep back into Bolton's thoughts. The ritual had worked, yes, but at what cost? The mystic's warnings echoed in his ears, haunting and foreboding. He glanced at the bowl, still half filled with the ghastly soup, now congealed into a tar-like substance. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. Margaret murmured, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. She looked at him, her face still pale but her eyes filled with a cautious hope. Do you think it's truly over?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to Liam, who lay breathing steadily on the bed. "I know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But look at him, Richard. He's getting better. Isn't that what matters?" Bolton nodded, his jaw tightening. Yes, that was what mattered. And yet, something felt wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had opened a door to something dark, something that could not be easily shut. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. Liam awoke, his eyes clearer, his voice stronger. Bolton and Margaret felt a surge of relief, rushing to his side, asking him how he felt. I'm hungry," Liam replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Margaret laughed, tears of joy streaming down her face as she kissed his forehead. Bolton felt his heart swell, the warmth of hope pushing back the fear gnawing at his soul. But as night began to fall, an unnatural chill settled into the mansion. The air grew heavy, the shadows darker, and an eerie silence enveloped the house. Bolton felt a knot of anxiety twist in his stomach, his instincts screaming that something was not right. He glanced at the door, half expecting to see something or someone looming in the hallway. In Liam's room, the candlelight flickered, casting long, distorted shapes against the walls. Liam, now sitting up, gazed around the room, his eyes wide with an unfocused intensity. Bolton moved closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Liam," he asked, his voice quivering. "Are you all right?" Liam turned to him, his eyes reflecting the candle's flame. For a moment, Bolton swore he saw something other lurking within those innocent eyes. A flicker of darkness that chilled him to his core. And then, just as quickly he was gone. Liam blinked, the ghostly shadow in his gaze vanishing, replaced by confusion. I'm fine," Daddy mumbled, rubbing his temples. "Just tired." Bolton forced a smile, though his heart pounded against his ribs. "That's all right. Rest now, my boy." We hear Margaret sat by the bedside, holding Liam's hand, whispering soothing words as he drifted back into sleep. But as Bolton stood watching, the sense of unease grew stronger. The room felt colder, the air thicker, pressing down on him like an invisible force. Something had changed. Something had followed them from the grave. And as he stared at his sleeping son, he couldn't help but feel that their ordeal was far from over. And somewhere in the shadows of the mansion, the heart that had been taken from the grave began to beat once more. Part 4. Strange Occurrences. The days that followed the ritual felt like a dream, a nightmare. It began subtly, like the first breath of a storm that no one notices until it is too late. Inside the Bolton mansion, the atmosphere grew thick, almost suffocating. Despite Liam's initial recovery, a sense of dread clung to every corner, like a shadow that refused to be dispelled. Bolton had hoped the ritual was the end of their suffering, but it was quickly becoming clear that something had followed them back from the darkness. It was there in the chill that settled over the house, in the way the light seemed to dim, even during the brightest parts of the day. The staff noticed it first. A maid, her face pale with fear, whispered to Margaret as they passed in the hallway. "Madame, I swear, I saw a figure standing in Liam's room last night. But when I looked again, it was gone." Margaret dismissed it as nerves, exhaustion from the stressful days that had passed. "Your mind is playing tricks on you," she said, offering a strange smile, though she herself had felt the same creeping chill. It was only later, as she walked down the hallway alone, that she felt the sensation of being watched. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but the hall was empty. The shadows, however, seemed to stretch and writhe up, mocking her. She hurried away, a knot of unease settling in her stomach. That night, Bolton sat in his study, staring at the documents on his desk without really seeing them. The room felt colder than usual, the air stagnant, pressing down on him. The fireplace blazed, yet the warmth failed to reach his bones. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but a soft sound caught his attention. A whisper. He stiffened, holding his breath. It was faint, almost indistinguishable, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But there, just at the edge of hearing, he could make out words. Horrid, fragmented words that clawed at his sanity. ... not over, never yours. Bolton jumped up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling as he scanned the room. His heart raced, thumping in his chest like a drumbeat of terror. But there was nothing, no one. The room was empty except for himself and the dancing shadows cast by the fire. With a shuddering breath, he ran a hand over his face damp with cold sweat. It was in his mind. It had to be. He was merely exhausted, worn thin by days of worry and fear. He turned back to his desk, gripping the edge for support. The whispering faded, but the chill remained, crawling up his spine like icy fingers. He knew then that the house had changed. Something unnatural had settled in, something that they could not see, but could feel in their very bones. Liam's behavior soon began to take on an unsettling edge. At first it seemed like simple fatigue. He slept longer than usual, his face often drawn and hollow. Margaret tended to him with a mother's care, trying to bring back the light in his eyes with soft words and warm meals. But as the days passed, her hope dwindled. One afternoon, she found him sitting at the edge of his bed, staring blankly out the window. His lips moved, forming silent words, as if conversing with an invisible presence. Margaret stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding. "Liam," she called gently. He did not respond. "Liam, who are you talking to?" Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned to face her. His eyes were vacant, cold, and utterly foreign. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. This was not her son. This was something wearing his face. A shiver ran through her as he whispered, "They're here." "They never left?" Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, dreading the answer. Liam's gaze drifted past her, to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. "Them. They watch us. They want." More. Margaret stumbled back, horror gripping her heart. She rushed out of the room, slamming the door shut, as if that could keep whatever darkness had crept into her son at bay. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing like gunshots through the now oppressively silent house. The nights grew worse. Whispers filled the halls, a cacophony of sinister murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Shadows moved on their own, slithering along the edges of vision, never fully visible but always felt. The servants avoided certain areas, claiming that they felt eyes watching them from the darkened corners. Bolton awoke one night to the sound of scratching. He bolted upright in bed, heart hammering in his chest. The sound was coming from the door, a slow, deliberate scraping. He strained his ears, praying it was just a trick of his imagination, but it persisted. He threw back the covers and crept toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming for him to stop. His hand shook as he reached for the handle. With a deep breath, he yanked the door open. The hallway beyond was empty, the scratching sound instantly ceasing. Cold air rushed past him, carrying with it the faintest whisper. "Leave, or suffer." Bolton staggered back, slamming the door shut. His heart felt like it would burst from his chest. What was happening? What had they unleashed upon their home? He backed away from the door, his eyes darting to the shadows that flickered across the walls. They seemed alive, twisting and writhing as if mocking his fear. Margaret was no better. She had taken to carrying a rosary, clutching it tightly, as if the beads could ward off the malevolent force that now permeated their lives. She prayed constantly, muttering under her breath whenever she entered Liam's room. But it offered little solace. The house was tainted, its very foundation groaning under the weight of whatever they had called forth. Liam continued to change. He no longer spoke to them, but they often caught him murmuring to himself, his eyes distant and glazed. He would sit in front of the fireplace for hours, watching the flames as if they held some secret only he could see. Once, Margaret found him in the attic, sitting amidst the dust and cobwebs, laughing softly to himself. "What are you doing up here?" she demanded, trying to keep the fear from choking her words. Liam turned to her, his face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight filtering through the attic window. His smile was twisted, unnatural. "Waiting," he replied simply, his voice a hollow echo. "They told me to wait." Margaret's heart twisted in her chest. "Who told you?" she asked, though deep down she dreaded the answer. Liam's eyes darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "The ones who whisper." "The ones who watched." She stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stack of old boxes, and fled the attic, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This was not her child. Something had taken hold of him, something malevolent and beyond her understanding. As the days passed, the house itself seemed to grow restless. Doors would creak open on their own, footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and objects moved from their places. Servants began quitting in fear, unwilling to remain in a place that seemed so deeply cursed. The remaining staff whispered about the strange occurrences, their faces pale with fear. The Bolton mansion, once a place of warmth and luxury, had become a prison, a tomb filled with unseen horrors. The nights brought no reprieve. Shadows lengthened and stretched unnaturally, sometimes taking shapes that looked almost human before dissipating into the darkness. The whispering voices grew louder, a constant, maddening chorus that no one could escape. Bolton often found himself pacing the halls in the dead of night, his eyes wild, muttering to himself as if to drown out the whispers. Liam was the worst of all. His once warm, joyful presence had been replaced by a cold, eerie calm. He refused to leave his room, claiming that it was safer there. When Bolton pressed him on what he meant, Liam only gave him a chilling smile and said, "They like the darkness here." Margaret wept, feeling helpless as she watched her son slip further away into whatever darkness had claimed him. She tried everything, doctors, priests, healers, but none could explain the change in Liam or the oppressive presence in the house. Each time, they left the mansion with grim faces, muttering about curses and evil spirits. One night, Bolton stood outside Liam's door, his heart pounding in his chest. From inside, he could hear his son speaking in low, guttural tones, as if holding a conversation with someone or something. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to make out the words. ... They won't leave until they take what they came for." Liam's voice rasped, followed by a chilling silence. Then, a deeper, almost inhuman whisper replied, "The debt must be paid, in full." Bolton staggered back, horror clenching at his heart. The realization crashed over him like a wave of ice. This was far from over. The ritual had not simply saved Liam, it had opened a door to something dark and hungry. And now, that darkness demanded a price far greater than he had ever imagined. As he backed away, the house groaned, the walls seeming to close in around him. In that moment, Bolton knew they were not alone. Something ancient and malevolent had claimed their home. And it was only a matter of time before it came to collect its due. Part 5. Possession. Days bled into nights, each one more unnerving than the last. The atmosphere in the Bolton mansion had grown stifling, thick with an unspoken terror. Liam, once a vibrant and carefree boy, was now a hollow shell of his former self, filled with a darkness that neither Bolton nor Margaret could comprehend. He locked himself in his room, emerging only when absolutely necessary. His meals went untouched, and any attempt to speak with him was met with eerie silence. Margaret begged Bolton to do something, anything, but even he was at a loss. Every ounce of hope they had felt after the ritual had evaporated, leaving only dread in its place. It was as if their home had been plunged into an endless winter, devoid of warmth and life. Bolton's eyes often wandered to the heavy oak door of Liam's room, beyond which lay secrets that no parent should ever have to face. Late one night, Bolton found himself standing outside Liam's door again, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. Something had changed in the past few days, something darker. The whispers that filled the house had become almost deafening in the small hours of the night, and Liam's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Bolton had to know what was happening to his son. Slowly, he turned the knob and pushed the door open, praying that his intrusion would go unnoticed. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle flickering on the far side, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he spotted Liam sitting in front of the vanity mirror. Bolton's breath hitched in his throat. Liam's back was to him, but Bolton could see his son's hands moving with unnerving precision, applying makeup. The sight sent a shiver crawling up his spine. On the vanity, bottles of rouge, powders, and lip color were strewn about in chaotic disarray. They weren't things Liam should possess, and yet here they were. Liam Bolton called out, his voice barely above a whisper, his stomach twisted in knots, every fiber of his being urging him to turn and leave. But he couldn't. He had to know. Liam paused, his hand holding a powder puff mid-air. Bolton watched, horrified, as his son's head tilted slightly, the candlelight catching the stark white of his painted face. Slowly, deliberately, Liam turned to face him. Bolton's heart plummeted into his stomach. The face looking back at him was not his son's. Liam's skin was unnaturally pale, powdered white like a corpse prepared for burial. His lips were painted a deep, bloody red, stretched into a grotesque grin that made Bolton's blood run cold. But it was those eyes that chilled him to his very core. They were as black as coal, endless voids that stared into him with a malice that was wholly inhuman. Liam Bolton stammered, struggling to find his voice. "What are you doing?" Liam's lips parted, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally in the candlelight. Then he spoke, and the sound sent a jolt of pure terror through Bolton's veins. The voice that emerged was not Liam's. It was feminine, cold, and echoing with a rage that had festered for ages. "Isn't it obvious, Mr. Bolton?" the voice put, dripping with contempt. "I'm preparing for my final performance." Bolton stumbled back, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. "Double, who are you?" he choked out, though deep down, he already knew the answer. The room around him seemed to grow darker, the shadows closing in like a shroud. The figure in the chair, his son, smiled wider, the edges of that painted mouth stretching unnervingly. "Lisa," it whispered, the name dripping from those crimson lips like poison. "You remember, don't you? The poor girl whose grave you defiled." Bolton's heart pounded against his ribcage, threatening to break free. His mind raced back to that terrible night, to the ritual that had promised to save his son. The heart. Lisa's heart. They had taken it from her grave, desecrating her final resting place in a desperate bid for salvation. And now she was here, inside his son. You can't be here," he gasped, his voice barely a croak. We didn't mean to," but the words faltered on his tongue, hollow and meaningless. What excuse could possibly suffice for what they had done? "Liam, or rather," Lisa stood slowly, the movements fluid yet unnaturally graceful, like a puppet controlled by strings. She turned fully towards Bolton, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze that pierced his soul. In that moment, Bolton felt a crushing weight settle over him. The room itself seemed to contract, suffocating him in darkness and despair. "Oh, but I am here," Lisa's voice sang mockingly, filling the room with an eerie resonance. "Did you think there would be no consequences? That you could rip me from my grave and use my heart like some trinket without paying the price?" Bolton staggered back, his back hitting the wall as his breath came in ragged gasps. The shadows around him swirled, closing in like a predator. "Please," he begged, though he knew not what he was pleading for. "Please, let my son go. This isn't his fault." Lisa's face twisted into a mask of fury, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Not his fault," she hissed, stepping forward. Bolton could feel the temperature in the room plummet, the air itself turning icy and thin. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is. You dared to disturb my rest, to steal what was mine. Now I shall have what is yours." Bolton's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, staring up at the figure of his son standing before him. Tears welled in his eyes as he reached out a trembling hand. "Liam," he sobbed, "dead. Please come back to me for a fleeting moment." The blackness in Liam's eyes flickered, a hint of his true self shining through. His lips quivered, and for the briefest of seconds, Bolton saw his son, the boy he had tried so desperately to save. But then, just as quickly, the darkness surged back, drowning that sliver of hope in an ocean of malice. "No," Lisa spat, her voice a venomous hiss. "Liam is mine now. Just as you took my heart, I have taken his." Bolton collapsed forward, clutching at the floor as sobs racked his body. The enormity of what he had done crashed down upon him like a tidal wave. He had saved his son's life, yes, but at what cost? He had unleashed a vengeful spirit, and now his son was lost, trapped within the malevolent grip of a soul bent on revenge. Lisa watched him, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She moved to the vanity, picking up the brush again and applying more powder to her face, humming softly as if preparing for some grim celebration. Bolton could only watch in horror as his son's body became a grotesque mockery of life, a vessel for a soul that should never have returned. "You'll pay for your sins," Mr. Bolton, Lisa murmured, glancing at him through the mirror's reflection. "You'll watch as I take everything you love, as I did with Liam, and only then will you understand the depths of what you've wrought." Bolton's throat tightened, and he could barely breathe. The shadows in the room twisted, forming shapes that seemed to leer at him, mocking his despair. He forced himself to his feet, backing away from the mirror. His son's, no, Lisa's reflection grinned back at him, eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. He stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. Outside, in the hallway, he clutched at his chest, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. His mind raced, searching for some solution, some way to undo what had been done. But all he could think of was the cold, piercing gaze of Lisa, staring out from his son's eyes, condemning him for his sins. As he stood there, gasping for breath, Bolton realized with dawning horror that he was powerless. Lisa had taken hold of his son's body, and there was nothing he could do to break her grip. She was here for vengeance, and she would not stop until every last bit of his life had been consumed by the darkness. The mansion seemed to groan around him, the walls closing in with a sinister creak. From within the room, the soft, mocking hum of Lisa's voice drifted through the door, sending chills down his spine. Bolton knew then that this was far from over. It was only the beginning of a nightmare that would drag him into the abyss. And in that moment, as he stood trembling in the hallway, Bolton felt the cold, suffocating grip of despair tighten around his heart. Lisa was not just inside his son, she was inside the very walls of their home. An inescapable darkness that promised nothing but suffering and ruin. Liam was gone, replaced by a vengeful spirit that would stop at nothing to exact her retribution. And as Bolton backed away from the door, he knew with gut-wrenching certainty that their nightmare had only just begun. Part 6. Nightmares and Torment. Bolton had barely slept since that horrifying encounter with his son, or whatever malevolent spirit now inhabited his son's body. Each night bled into the next, a cycle of torment that left him exhausted, frayed, and increasingly paranoid. His once grand mansion, filled with laughter and life, had transformed into a prison of shadows and dread, and at its heart, Lisa lingered, her presence a constant reminder of the unspeakable mistake he had made. Sleep came to him in jagged fragments, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. But even in those brief, fitful moments of rest, Bolton found no solace. His dreams, if they could be called that, were nothing short of nightmares, so vivid and visceral they felt like alternate realities. The lines between what was real and what was imagined blurred, leaving him gasping for breath and drenched in cold sweat. It always began the same way. Bolton would find himself standing in a graveyard, the fog thick around his feet, swirling like a cauldron of malevolence. The air was icy, stinging his skin and seeping into his bones. Around him, tombstones jutted out of the earth like jagged teeth, each one bearing the names of those he had wronged. In the distance, a lone figure stood at the edge of the cemetery, shrouded in shadows. Her form was unmistakable. "Lisa," he would whisper, the name escaping his lips like a curse. As if hearing him, the figure would slowly turn, revealing a face obscured by darkness and decay. Bolton's heart would lurch, the rhythm suddenly erratic, as though trying to escape the confines of his chest. And then the pain would begin. It started as a dull throb, a small arc in the center of his chest. But with every step he took towards the figure, the pain would intensify, spreading like wildfire through his veins. It was as if his heart were being squeezed by an unseen hand, crushed under an unimaginable force. Bolton would clutch his chest, gasping for breath, each inhale more labored than the last. The fog would close in, wrapping around him like the tendrils of some monstrous entity. He would try to scream, to call for help, but no sound would emerge from his throat, only silence. And Lisa would watch, her eyes glowing like twin embers in the darkness, filled with a mixture of sorrow and fury. Then, just as the agony reached its peak, he would awaken, drenched in sweat, clutching at the sheets as if they were the only things anchoring to reality. But reality was no less terrifying. Lisa's presence permeated every inch of their mansion. In the daylight, she lurked in the corners of his vision, a shadow that danced just beyond the edge of perception. He would turn, expecting to see her standing there, and though the space would be empty, he felt her gaze bore into him, unblinking and relentless. At night she was bolder. The hallways echoed with whispers, unintelligible murmurs that sent chills racing down his spine. Floorboards creaked as if under the weight of unseen footsteps, and doors would slowly swing open, their hinges groaning in protest. Bolton would find himself frozen, staring into the darkness of an open doorway, half expecting Lisa to emerge and drag him into the abyss. But it was Liam, or rather what was left of him, that tormented Bolton the most. The boy barely left his room, and when he did, it was in a state that defied comprehension. His eyes were vacant, hollow, staring through his father as though Bolton were the ghost haunting the mansion, not the other way around. Bolton tried speaking to him, pleading for any sign of his true son, but Liam would only smile, that eerie, knowing grin that twisted Bolton's stomach into knots. Father Liam would whisper in a voice not his own, "How does it feel to have the sins of the past come crawling back?" Bolton would recoil, stumbling away from the boy who wore his son's face. The pain in his chest would flare, an agonizing reminder of the ritual that had set this nightmare into motion. It had been a mistake, God, how he wished he could take it back, but it was too late. The ritual had been completed, and now he was paying the price. Days passed in a haze of fear and regret. Bolton found himself retreating into the library, searching through every tome and journal for some inkling of how to undo what had been done. The mystic who had guided him into this madness was nowhere to be found, having vanished like a phantom. Bolton was on his own, drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. The chest pains grew worse with each passing day. It was as if his heart was a living, tortured thing within him, struggling to break free. At times, the throbbing would become so intense that it would bring him to his knees, his vision blurring as he gasped for breath. Margaret, terrified for her husband's health, begged him to see a doctor, but he knew the truth, this pain was not of the flesh. It was Lisa. She was inside him, punishing him from the inside out for the crime he had committed. One night, as Bolton sat at the edge of his bed, massaging his temples in a futile attempt to soothe the pounding in his skull, he caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. He turned slowly, his eyes widening in horror. Behind him, standing in the corner of the room, was Lisa. Her face was a mask of rage and sorrow, the skin pale and splotched with decay. Her eyes, once hauntingly beautiful, were now black pits, bottomless and filled with a malice that made Bolton's blood run cold. Her lips twisted into a cruel smile, and she pointed a skeletal finger towards him. "Do you feel it, Mr. Bolton?" she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Your heart struggling to beat under the weight of your guilt." Bolton shot up from the bed, stumbling backwards until his back hit the wall. His hands flew to his chest as the pain surged, sharper than ever before. It felt as if something inside him was tearing, ripping apart the very fabric of his being. He wanted to scream, to yell for help, but all that escaped was a strangled gasp. "You did this," Lisa continued, her voice filling the room, suffocating him with its presence. "You tore me from my grave, used my heart for your selfish desires. And now I will tear yours apart piece by piece." No, Bolton rasped, his vision blurring as the pain radiated outwards, clawing at his lungs and throat. "Please, I'm sorry, I didn't know." Lisa tilted her head, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Didn't know," she sneered. You knew, and you did it anyway. Now you know the suffering of the restless dead." Bolton dropped to his knees, clutching at his chest, as if he could reach inside and pull out the agony that racked his body. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one more painful than the last. It felt as if his heart was being squeezed, compressed by an invisible vice. He glanced up at Liza, his eyes pleading for mercy. But there was none. She stared down at him, her expression cold and unyielding. The room darkened, the shadows creeping closer, swallowing the light. Bolton felt himself slipping, his consciousness teetering on the edge of a void. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Lisa's smile, a twisted, satisfied grin that burned itself into his mind. He awoke on the floor, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The pain in his chest had subsided, but it lingered beneath the surface, a reminder of the torment that awaited him. He lay there for a long while, staring up at the ceiling, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep, knowing that Lisa was waiting, always waiting. As Bolton dragged himself to his feet, a wave of dizziness washed over him. His reflection in the mirror caught his eye, and he froze. His face was pale, gaunt, the eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. But it was his chest that drew his attention. The skin there was mottled, bruised, as if something inside him had clawed its way out. Terror gripped him, and he turned away from the mirror, clutching his arms around himself. This was Lisa's doing. She was inside him, tormenting him from within, her fury taking form in his nightmares and his body. He stumbled to the door, fumbling with the handle before wrenching it open. He needed air, space to think, to breathe. He staggered down the hallway, the walls closing in on him with every step. The house was silent, oppressively so, but Bolton could feel eyes watching him, lurking in the darkness. Lisa was here, in every shadow, in every creak of the floorboards. She was the house now, and he was trapped within her grasp. Desperation clawed at his mind as he made his way to the front door. He needed to escape, to find a way to rid himself of this curse. But as he reached for the door, a sharp, searing pain exploded in his chest. He cried out, collapsing against the doorframe, clutching at his heart. "Leaving so soon," Mr. Bolton, Lisa's voice whispered in his ear, cold and mocking. "You can't run from what you've done. You can't escape me." Bolton screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the empty halls. The pain intensified, a burning, twisting agony that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. He dropped to his knees, his vision dimming as darkness closed in once more. And in that darkness he heard Lisa's laughter echoing around him, filling his ears with the sound of his doom. Fear and regret consumed him, threatening to drown him in their depths. He had unleashed something far beyond his control, and now it was feeding on his very soul. As the shadows wrapped around him, Bolton realized that this was his punishment, a torment that would never end. Lisa would not let him go. She would drag him into the abyss, piece by agonizing piece, until there was nothing left of the man who had dared to defile her rest. And in his final moments of consciousness, as he slipped into the void, Bolton knew one thing with horrifying certainty: the nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. Part 7. The Night of Horror. The night was thick with a suffocating darkness, the kind that settled deep into the bones and refused to let go. Mr. Bolton lay on the edge of his bed, clutching his chest as waves of pain surged through him. His breaths were shallow, each exhale labored, strained as if his lungs were wrapped in a tightening vice. Margaret sat nearby, her face pale and stricken with fear, clutching a candle that flickered madly in the drafty room. She watched her husband, helpless to alleviate his torment. "Something is." "Inside me," Bolton gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, eyes wide with terror. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the bedsheets beneath him. Margaret reached out, trembling, her fingers grazing his arm. It was clammy, like the skin of a corpse. Outside, a violent storm brewed, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the room's walls. The wind howled, carrying with it what seemed like faint whispers. From the corner of the room a chill emanated, spreading across the floor like a creeping fog. Bolton's agony increased, his chest now swelling unnaturally with each ragged breath. The pain radiated, clawing at him from the inside, searing through his flesh. He let out a guttural moan, his body arching off the bed, as if possessed. Margaret stumbled backward, her candle falling to the floor and extinguishing, plunging the room into darkness save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the scene with terrifying clarity. Suddenly a voice, soft, ethereal, yet dripping with malice, echoed through the room, freezing Margaret's blood. "It was Lisa. You took what was mine," the voice hissed, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Now I take what is yours." "No." "No," Bolton screamed, clutching at his chest. His hands clawed at his skin, as if trying to rip away the source of his agony. The swelling grew, pulsating beneath his fingertips, each beat like the drum of a war march. His eyes bulged with horror and pain, pupils dilating as he stared down at his own body in disbelief. With a thunderous clap of lightning, the room was thrown into a brilliant white light. For a split second, Margaret saw it something right in beneath Bolton's skin, pushing outwards, desperate to break free. The bulge moved like a snake trapped under a thin sheet, its erratic movements distorting his flesh in ways that defied nature. Margaret's scream pierced the night as Bolton convulsed violently, his body thrashing against the mattress. The room filled with the wet, sickening sound of flesh tearing. Bolton's chest split open, a grotesque rupture that sprayed dark blood across the room. From within the gaping wound something wriggled, pushing its way out with a squelching noise that turned Margaret's stomach. The thing that emerged was a mass of pulsing, crimson tissue, veined and slick with blood. It twisted and contorted, a ghastly mimicry of a heart, but larger, more deformed, Its surface glistened with an unnatural sheen, twitching as if alive. It sat upon Bolton's chest, beating with a rhythm that filled the room with a hollow, echoing thump. Bolton's face contorted in a rictus of horror and pain. His eyes, glazed and unfocused, locked onto the thing that had erupted from him. He gasped for air, his voice choked with terror. "Sir, Lisa," he managed to croak, the realization dawning upon him even as his life ebbed away. Margaret staggered, her mind refusing to comprehend the nightmare before her. She backed away, her body trembling uncontrollably, eyes fixed on the monster's heart. It beat faster, each pulse sending tremors through the room. Shadows gathered around it, coiling and twisting, forming shapes that loomed ominously over the bed. The room grew colder, the air thickening with a deathly silence broken only by the heart's relentless thumping. Margaret felt a suffocating pressure, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The heart continued to swell and contract, oozing a dark, viscous liquid that pooled on the bedsheets. Bolton let out one final, gurgling scream. His body jerked violently before collapsing into stillness. His eyes remained open, staring lifelessly at the ceiling, reflecting the flicker of lightning from the storm outside. The room was filled with an eerie quiet, save for the slow, heavy drip of blood falling from the bed to the floor. Margaret could not tear her eyes away from the grotesque sight. The heart atop Bolton's body moved once more, its surface undulating as if something beneath it was wriggling to get free. In the faint light of the storm, she saw its faces, distorted and trapped within the heart's flesh, pressing outwards as if screaming in agony. Lisa's face appeared among them, her mouth stretched wide in a silent howl of rage. "No, this can't be real," Margaret whimpered, sinking to her knees. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth, trying to banish the nightmare that refused to dissipate. But it was real. And as the heart pulsed, the room filled with Lisa's chilling laughter, echoing from the walls like a chorus of damned souls. "You thought you could take what belonged to me," the voice taunted. "Now you will suffer for your sins." Margaret could feel the walls closing in, the darkness swallowing her whole. She felt Lisa's cold, vengeful presence around her, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Tears streamed down her face as the room seemed to twist around her, bending reality into a grotesque, surreal nightmare. The heart, still pulsing on Bolton's corpse, began to shrink and darken, its once bright crimson turning black as coal. It shriveled up, the faces within its surface contorting in final agony before melting away. Finally, it stopped beating and lay still, a blackened, lifeless husk upon the gory remains of what had been Bolton's chest. Silence filled the room once more, broken only by the storm's distant rumble. Margaret, shaking and drenched in cold sweat, stared at the ruin of her husband, her mind shattered by the horror she had witnessed. She knew, deep down, that the nightmare was far from over. Lisa's curse had only just begun. Part 8. The fatal end. The Bolton mansion stood eerily quiet as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Margaret, drenched in sweat and nearly paralyzed by fear, found herself unable to shake off the horrific memories of the night. She ventured hesitantly into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, dread weighing down on her with every step. The house, usually filled with warmth and life, now felt like a tomb, cold, empty, and haunted by something far more sinister than any nightmare she could have ever imagined. Margaret stopped just outside their bedroom door, taking a deep, shaky breath before slowly turning the doorknob. The room was dim, bathed in the faint, grey morning light filtering through the curtains. Her eyes fell on the bed where Bolton lay still, the twisted sheets strewn about, stained with dark patches of dried blood. Her heart thudded loudly in her ears, her stomach churning at the sight. Bolton's body was sprawled across the mattress in an unnatural pose, limbs twisted grotesquely. His face, frozen in a final expression of sheer horror, stared up at the ceiling. His mouth was agape, eyes wide and unseeing, reflecting the agony of his final moments. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat as she approached him, her eyes drawn to the deep, jagged claw marks etched into his chest. "Oh, dear God," she whispered, choking on the words. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, unable to tear her gaze away from the mutilated body of her husband. The room was silent except for the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past weeks, the ritual, the changes in Liam, the constant sense of foreboding that had settled over their lives like a dark cloud. She had never believed in curses or spirits, but what lay before her was undeniable proof that they had crossed a line, meddled with forces beyond their comprehension. Bolton's chest bore the marks of a gruesome struggle, as if he had tried to claw something out from within. His flesh was torn and shredded, the gaping wound revealing glimpses of bone beneath. Blood had soaked the sheets, congealing into a sticky mess that filled the room with the stench of decay. Margaret could feel herself losing grip on reality as she stared at the horror, her mind struggling to accept what she was seeing. Desperately, she crawled closer, reaching out a trembling hand to touch Bolton's face. It was cold, deathly cold. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and she recoiled instantly, feeling the unnatural stiffness of rigor mortis. She clutched her hand to her chest, tears streaming down her face. How had it come to this? They had only wanted to save Liam, to give him a chance at life, but instead they had unleashed a nightmare. As she sat there, paralyzed by fear and grief, the room seemed to darken around her. Shadows crept along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her lungs, making it hard to breathe. A cold whisper swept through the room, chilling Margaret to her core. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the oppressive silence, a low, raspy sound like the rattling of breath. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes darting around the room. For a moment, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind in a heightened state of fear. But then she heard it again, this time clearer, a faint, gasping wheeze. "No, it can't be," she muttered, her voice shaking. Her eyes flicked back to Bolton's body, half expecting to see him move. But he lay as still as ever, his lifeless gaze fixed on nothing. Margaret felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as the sound grew louder, filling the room with its eerie cadence. And then, from the shadows near the bed, something stirred. Margaret's heart nearly stopped as she watched in terror. The shadows began to coalesce, forming a dark, shapeless mass that writhed and twisted like a living thing. From within the darkness, a pale face emerged, gaunt and hollow-eyed, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque semblance of a grin. Lisa, Margaret gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. It was her, the girl they had desecrated, whose heart they had stolen in their desperate bid to save Liam. Her ghostly form hovered above the bed, her eyes black, endless voids fixed on Bolton's corpse. "You took what was mine," the apparition hissed, her voice echoing in the room like the creaking of a coffin lid. "And now you will suffer as I have." Margaret backed away, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching out like skeletal fingers, grasping at her limbs. She stumbled, nearly falling as she scrambled toward the door, her mind screaming at her to flee. But Lisa's spectre moved with unnatural speed, blocking her path. Margaret froze, her eyes wide with terror as a ghostly figure loomed over her. Lisa's pale hand reached out, passing through the air as if it were smoke. When her icy fingers brushed against Margaret's cheek, a surge of cold shot through her body, paralyzing her with fear. "You will pay," Lisa intoned, her voice dripping with malice. "For the darkness you have brought upon yourself." Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She felt as though her heart might burst from her chest, the fear so overwhelming it threatened to consume her. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for it all to end, for this nightmare to release its grip on her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the room fell silent. Margaret opened her eyes cautiously, finding herself alone once more. The shadows had receded, leaving the room bathed in the bleak morning light. Bolton's body lay still, the ghostly presence gone, but the chill in the air lingered, a reminder of the horrors that had transpired. Margaret stumbled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to get out to find help, to escape this cursed house. But as she turned to leave, her eyes fell on Bolton's lifeless face, twisted in that final expression of terror. And she knew, deep down, that there was no escaping what they had done. The consequences of their actions had been set into motion, and now they had to face the darkness they had unleashed. Margaret's heart sank as she realized that the nightmare was far from over. They had tampered with forbidden forces, and the price for such transgressions was far steeper than she had ever imagined. As she staggered out of the room, her mind swirled with horror and regret. The echoes of Lisa's whispers followed her, a haunting reminder that some deeds could never be undone. And somewhere in the depths of the house, a soft, echoing laugh filled the air, cold, mocking, and full of malice. Margaret fled down the hallway, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the empty house. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. She ran blindly, driven by a primal instinct to survive, but the laughter followed her, growing louder, more insistent. It was the laughter of the damned, a final taunt from the spirit they had wronged. And as Margaret burst out of the front door into the cold morning light, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the Bolton family had not just failed to save her life. They had awakened something far worse than death or darkness that would haunt them for eternity. Certainly. Here's a detailed and immersive ending for Part 9, focusing on horror, emotion, and the grim finality of the tale. Part 9. Vengeance Fulfilled. The dawn rose sluggishly, casting a dull grey light across the Bolton mansion. A deathly stillness permeated the air, thicker, heavier than any fog. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, mourning the horrors it had witnessed and the malevolent forces that now lingered within its walls. Margaret wandered through the house in a daze, her mind fractured by the events of the past nights. Bolton's mangled body still lay upstairs, twisted in an eternal grimace of terror. The once grand home that had echoed with laughter now bore the scars of darkness, every creak and shadow serving as a reminder of the price they had paid. The scent of death clung to the air, mingling with the bitter cold that seeped from the very foundation of the house. She paused at the entrance of Liam's room. The door stood slightly ajar, the darkness inside like an open maw, daring her to enter. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest. She knew what she would find, yet something compelled her to take that final step into the abyss. As Margaret pushed the door open, the room greeted her with an unnatural chill. There, in the middle of the room, stood her son Liam. His back was turned, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He stood unnaturally still, his head slightly cocked to one side, as though listening to whispers only he could hear. Margaret's stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. "Liam," she called out, her voice barely a tremor in the thick silence. For a moment there was no response. Then, ever so slowly, Liam turned. When his face came into view, Margaret recoiled in horror. The boy she once knew was gone, replaced by a ghastly visage. His skin was pale, stretched too tight over his bones, and his eyes, oh those eyes, were dark, endless voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. His lips curled into a smile that was too wide, too grotesque. "It's not Liam anymore," he said, his voice layered with an otherworldly echo. It was both his voice and not, a hideous mixture of innocence and malevolence. "You know what you have done, Mother. You defied my rest, and now I will take what is owed." Margaret stumbled back, her knees threatening to give way. "Lisa," she gasped, choking on the name. "Please." "We didn't mean for this," Lisa, speaking through Liam's twisted form, let out a chilling laugh that filled the room with an icy dread. "Didn't mean," she mocked, her tone dripping with venom. "You took what was sacred. You used my heart to cheat death, to defy the natural order. Now, the debt must be paid." Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs as she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please let my son go," she begged. "Take me instead, but spare him." The room darkened as shadows writhed and twisted, creeping along the walls and pooling at Margaret's feet. Lisa's gaze bored into her, those black eyes piercing through to her very soul. "Your pleas are meaningless," she hissed. "The moment you disturbed my grave, your fate was sealed." A gust of wind swept through the room, though all the windows were shut. Papers flew off the desk, and the curtains flapped wildly as if caught in a storm. The temperature plummeted, and a low, sinister hum vibrated through the air. Lisa's spirit began to glow faintly, a sickly green light emanating from Liam's small frame, illuminating his ghastly features. The shadows moved faster, spiraling around the room, coalescing into grotesque forms that danced and writhed. Margaret could feel the ground beneath her trembling. The walls seemed to pulse, like the very house was alive and angry. A cacophony of whispers filled the room, accusations, lamentations, and vengeful cries from beyond the grave. The voices grew louder, more insistent, filling Margaret's mind until she felt like she would go mad. And then, with a bone-chilling shriek, the shadows lunged at her. Margaret screamed, shielding her face with her hands, but the shadows enveloped her, clawing and tearing at her clothes and skin. It felt as though icy hands were dragging her down, pulling her into an endless void. She struggled, gasping for breath, her cries mingling with the cacophony around her. "You will know our suffering," Lisa's voice boomed, echoing through the room like the tolling of a death knell. "You will be consumed by the darkness you created." As Margaret writhed in agony, the shadows tightened their grip, squeezing the life from her. Her vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges, as a suffocating coldness spread through her limbs. Just when she thought she could endure no more, a piercing wail filled the room. Liam's body convulsed violently. The light around him intensified, blindingly bright, as the shadows recoiled. His back arched, and for a brief moment his eyes returned to their normal color. "Mom," he cried out, his voice filled with terror and pain. "Help me." But Margaret was powerless, trapped in the grip of the shadows that held her. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out towards her son, her fingers inches away from his outstretched hand. "Liam," she screamed, but the words were drowned out by Lisa's malevolent laughter. The room erupted in chaos. The shadows swirled violently around Liam, encasing him in a whirlwind of darkness. Margaret watched in horror as Lisa's spirit began to separate from her son's body, a distorted, wraith-like figure hovering above him. Lisa's face twisted in fury as she glared down at Margaret. "Your suffering has just begun," Lisa spat. With a final, soul-chilling scream, her spirit shot towards the ceiling, tearing through the fabric of reality itself. The force of it knocked Margaret to the ground, sending her sprawling as the shadows dissipated, leaving the room in deafening silence. For a moment, nothing moved. Margaret lay on the cold, wooden floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling. Slowly she raised her head, her eyes searching for her son. Liam lay on the floor, still and pale, his eyes closed. "Liam," Margaret called towards him, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. His skin was cold, too cold. "No, please, no," she sobbed, gathering his lifeless body into her arms. The air around her grew quiet, an oppressive stillness settling over the room. It was over. The vengeful spirit of Lisa had left, but not without exacting her dreadful price. The ritual they had performed to cheat death had brought nothing but doom upon them. So Margaret rocked back and forth, clutching her son's body, her cries echoing in the emptiness. The house, once filled with warmth and life, now lay as a shell of its former self, haunted by the consequences of their actions. It would forever be marked by the darkness they had brought upon themselves. The sun rose higher, its light spilling into the room, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within the Bolton mansion. But inside, an atmosphere of eternal horror lingered, a grim testament to the wrath of a disturbed soul. For Lisa's vengeance had been fulfilled. The Boltons had tampered with forces beyond their understanding, and now they would suffer the eternal consequences. Margaret's anguished cries faded into silence as the house resumed its stillness, becoming a monument to the darkness that now resided within its walls, a darkness that would never be banished. And so, the tale ended not with salvation, but with a haunting truth: those who disturb the dead awaken horrors beyond imagining, and such transgressions can never be undone.